Okay, let's unpack this. If you, like us, deeply love hip hop, if it's the soundtrack to your life, but you sometimes find yourself maybe disturbed by certain lyrics, or perhaps you grapple with where the line is, between clever wordplay and just outright misogyny, then you are precisely where you need to be. Today, we're taking a real deep dive into the complex, often uncomfortable, but absolutely vital issue of misogyny within hip-hop. Our focus will be on its historical roots, its manifestations and lyrics, and the industry structures that kind of perpetuate it, using the contrasting cases of iconic artists like Biggie Smalls and Young M.A. This isn't about finger-pointing or, condemnation. It's about a nuanced understanding, drawing heavily from the incredibly insightful discussions and research presented in a recent session of Professor Kimya's class.
That's absolutely right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, our mission with this deep dive is really to move beyond mere critique. We aim to genuinely understand the multifaceted complexities of misogyny and, importantly, misogynoir within the culture. We'll explore precise definitions, trace their origins, and critically examine what genuine evolution might look like for an art form that holds such immense cultural power. This is about seeking solutions, fostering deeper awareness, and ultimately envisioning a more inclusive and reflective future for hip-hop, an art form that so many of us, across generations, cherish deeply.
Now, when we discuss legendary lyricists, especially those who shaped the sound of New York, the name the Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls from Brooklyn, it immediately comes to mind for so many people. He is undeniably an icon, a true giant whose influence is just felt across the genre. But how, then, do we begin to connect this celebrated artist's figure held in such high regard with a concept as troubling as misogyny? It's a question that might feel like blasphemy to some, especially given his revered status, but it's a critical one that Professor Kimya's class didn't shy away from at all.
It's interesting you bring up Biggie, because this exact question came up in a history of hip-hop class I was in recently, or as part of Professor Kimya's broader discussions on the genre's evolution. My professor asked the class, "Who's in your top 10 MCs?" When I shared my list, my professor noticed Biggie wasn't on it. There was genuine shock, especially since I'm from New York, right? For me, Biggie's lyrical content, while undeniably skilled, was heavily focused on money and materialism. There wasn't really a deeper message or social commentary that resonated with me on the same level as, other MCs. I'm not denying his lyrical prowess, don't get me wrong, but he simply isn't in my top 10 or even my top 25. And honestly, when you listen to his debut album, Ready to Die, from beginning to end, as we did in class, it's a very disturbing album. The themes of violence, self-destruction, and the portrayal of women throughout the narrative are profoundly unsettling. It becomes even more ironic, in light of recent events, when you consider his relationship with Sean Combs. Diddy, Professor Kimya's class truly emphasized how re-listening to Biggie's lyrics now, with Diddy's controversies in mind, gives them a completely different, darker resonance. It just hits differently, as they say.
I completely concur with that assessment, and it's a perspective shared by many engaged in critical analysis of hip-hop, including discussions within Professor Kimya's class. Biggie is not on my top 30 list of MCs either, and I state that as someone who appreciates hip-hop culture enough to own a Biggie Smalls shirt picked up years ago at a thrift store, right? My appreciation for the genre is immense, but let's be clear. I am not a Biggie fan in the sense of viewing him as a profound lyricist. I can enjoy a few of his songs, sure, but I don't consider his body of work to be consistently lyrical in the way that truly exceptional MCs are. This sentiment, as we often see in discussions, can evoke intense reactions. For instance, when I critique Jay-Z, because for me, Jay-Z, despite his commercial success, isn't really a top-tier MC in terms of lyrical depth, people often react with genuine outrage. It's akin to a cult following around certain artists where any critique is perceived as blasphemy. Professor Kimya's class frequently emphasizes the importance of having these critical discussions without that kind of fanatical loyalty, allowing for objective analysis of the art form and its impact, rather than just blind admiration.
That's a crucial point, and it leads us directly into a broader conversation that Professor Kimya's class often explores. We're already touching on Sean Combs, Diddy, and his role in the industry, and it's clear his influence isn't an isolated phenomenon. As Professor Kimya highlighted, his rise and the way he operated connect to a much broader, longer history of Black producers, entrepreneurs, and discoverers behind the scenes in Black music. This pattern stretches back well over a century, long predating the emergence of hip-hop. It's a deeply entrenched aspect of the music industry's power dynamics.
What's truly fascinating, and a consistent theme in our discussions, is how often serious allegations against powerful figures in the industry only truly gain traction when their power begins to wane. Take the case of R. Kelly, for instance. For years, he was notoriously known within certain circles for picking up girls, for driving his car to high schools, perhaps even middle schools, with a clear pattern of problematic behavior. Yet, public reckoning was slow. It was only years later, when Aaliyah's age and the allegations surrounding their marriage became central to legal and public discourse, that many people expressed shock. It's vital for us to remember that while age limits for activities like alcohol consumption, military service, or marriage can vary by culture globally in the United States, we have very clear laws regarding consensual sex with legal adults. These laws, which apply to both boys and girls, state that you cannot be 14, 15, 16, or 17 and have consensual sex with a legal adult. Period. This isn't just about R. Kelly, as Professor Kimya's class also analyzed other examples. Consider MC Lyte, a revered artist whose lyric about wanting 17-year-olds when she was 19. That lyric, from someone often lauded as a foundational female MC, also takes on a different, more problematic dimension when viewed through this critical lens of age dynamics and power, prompting important questions about accountability across the board, regardless of the artist's gender or stature.
And the persistence of this problematic music in our culture, even when artists face serious allegations, is striking. I recently had a client for an upcoming DJ event who specifically requested R. Kelly songs. I was taken aback, asking, is it too early for this? Should we be playing this? And her response was simply, look, I don't care what anyone thinks. I love this music and I have to play it. This anecdote perfectly illustrates the enduring presence of music, despite its deeply problematic origins or artist behaviors, making it a constant challenge for those of us trying to navigate these ethical waters in our work.
That anecdote is a crucial reflection of a broader reality that Professor Kimya's class frequently unpacks. For us, as people of immediate African descent, it's often genuinely impossible to abandon everyone and everything simply because of problematic actions or histories. This complex reality extends to our family members, entire genres of music, and even historical legends like David Ruffin, when you delve into some of the troubling aspects of their personal lives. When we discuss misogyny, particularly within Black communities, there's often a knee-jerk reaction, especially from some men in certain religious realms, to silence the conversation. The fear is that addressing these issues will close the door for everyone, somehow invalidate our culture or history, or provide ammunition for external forces. But this deep dive, much like the class discussions, is precisely not about that. It means we absolutely must engage in factual, critical discussions to understand how to truly evolve. Harold Cruz, a pivotal Black intellectual, deeply explored Negro evolution as something far beyond mere revolution. Revolution, as he posited, can be about endless marching and talking. But true evolution demands the development of robust concepts, profound theories, and their consistent application into concrete actions that yield real, systemic changes. This means we cannot spend all our energy blaming external forces. We must urgently address internal harms. Within our families, our communities, our schools, including our beloved HBCUs, our organizations, religious groups, and crucially, issues of financial transparency in groups that raise funds but lack honest, rigorous accountability. For instance, when Professor Kimya's class celebrated Marcus Garvey and the 111 years of the UNIA, which he co-founded with Amy Ashford Garvey, a vital part of the discussion included Garvey's remarkable honesty regarding financial records. As documented by Amy Jacques Garvey, he kept meticulous accounts, even employing white Jewish accountants at the time. Yet even with this transparency, there were still critiques regarding the quality assurance needed for money management, particularly concerning the logistics of the ships going to Liberia. This historical precedent underscores that accountability and financial transparency are perpetual necessities, whether in a nascent global movement or in the modern music industry. So when we engage in these critical discussions about misogyny, it is not, as some might fear, about bashing men indiscriminately, but rather about holding accountable those who truly deserve it based on actions and their impact.
If I could jump in here on the topic of revolution and accountability. A couple of years ago, Dream Hampton, a highly respected cultural critic and co-producer of the Ladies First documentary series, gave a compelling interview in the Washington Post during hip-hop's 50th anniversary. She pointed out something profoundly uncomfortable that Professor Kimya's class spent significant time dissecting. That the big three foundational figures in hip-hop, Dr. Dre, Afrika Bambaataa, and Russell Simmons, have all been accused of actions that were very harmful to Black women. This was a critical blind spot, something we collectively tended to gloss over amidst the celebratory atmosphere of the 50th anniversary events. And it ties directly into the essence of what you were just outlining about true evolution. Dream Hampton posed this piercing question. Is hip-hop revolutionary if we are being misogynistic and homophobic at the same time? Can you truly be revolutionary and embody those destructive elements simultaneously? This, for me, and for many in our discussions, is where it gets really interesting and challenging.
That's a profound, almost uncomfortable question she raises, and it leads us directly to specific historical instances in hip-hop that many of us who came up in the culture are intimately familiar with. It connects directly to the allegations surrounding Africa Bambaataa, a figure foundational to hip-hop.
And that's precisely why many of us left the Universal Zulu Nation. They attempted to cover up those allegations.
Yes, exactly. For those who may not know the specifics, Africa Bambaataa, revered as a godfather of hip-hop and founder of the Universal Zulu Nation, was accused of abusing boys. The Universal Zulu Nation, the organization he founded, attempted to cover up these serious allegations, which ultimately led to many, including Dantre Somi here, leaving the organization in protest. For us old heads, this was a monumental, shocking revelation that profoundly affected our understanding of hip-hop's origins. But for younger generations who might only know Planet Rock as a party anthem, the historical context of these accusations and Bambaataa's role is often lost. A skilled DJ might seamlessly mix in his tracks, sure, but the underlying problematic history is frequently divorced from the music itself.
And what's consistently crucial here, as Professor Kimya's class emphasized through multiple case studies, is the pervasive pattern we see. These moguls, these seemingly untouchable leaders across various cultural realms, often only face court cases or public reckoning when their power has already significantly waned. Russell Simmons, for example, was not the kingmaker he once was when that damning documentary detailing allegations against him came out. Sean Combs, Diddy, certainly doesn't wield the same ubiquitous influence today that he commanded 20 years ago. Similarly, Bill Cosby did not have the same power in the 2000s that he did at the height of his career in the 80s and 90s. The clear pattern is that when these figures lose their stranglehold on influence, that's when people, witnesses, victims, former collaborators, feel less afraid to come out and say, yes, I witnessed this, or I was a part of this, or I was a victim. When they're at the absolute height of their power, like R. Kelly was for decades, many, both men and women, abuse that power with apparent impunity. Even with rampant rumors and witnesses everywhere, true accountability often seems to wait, almost strategically, until that formidable influence diminishes.
And that dynamic of waning power isn't limited to issues of abuse. It extends to other deeply problematic areas within hip-hop, such as homophobia. Many of my favorite artists, those I grew up listening to, unfortunately have homophobic lyrics in their discographies. Take EPMD's Rampage, for example. The verse from Parrish starts off with a blatant F-word. As much as I appreciate the musicality of that song, I consistently have to either skip that lyric or simply disengage from it. Similarly, Smith & Wesson's album included the derogatory term PWA. This presents a significant and ongoing challenge for DJs, especially those who play a wide range of genres like reggae or classic New York hip-hop. You need to be acutely aware of the languages and the specific contexts because you might unknowingly be playing something deeply offensive. Fortunately, and this is a positive development that Professor Kimya's class discussed, some artists, like Smith & Wesson, have created alternative, sanitized versions of their songs for radio play or streaming. This demonstrates that changes can be made, even if the primary motivation is often broader audience acceptance and commercial viability rather than a fundamental shift in ideology. It still represents a step towards a more inclusive soundscape.
So on that note of challenging problematic content, the insights you shared earlier on the nuances of misogynoir were particularly impactful. Could you elaborate on how your understanding evolved, perhaps drawing from the framework discussed in Professor Kimya's class?
Absolutely. It was a pivotal moment for me, one that truly reshaped my understanding of misogyny and, later, misogynoir, and it happened right in the midst of our community work, a moment that was later discussed in Professor Kimya's class as a tangible example of personal transformation. We were organizing a b-boy battle, a really important community event, and a friend, Spunk, had designed a two-sided flyer. One side depicted dynamic b-boys battling, capturing the essence of the event. The other side, however, featured a young lady with a prominent backside on a motorcycle, standing up with her butt cheeks clearly visible. Now, I'm not going to lie, when Spunk presented it, his reasoning was purely pragmatic. When we do these b-boy battles, only the b-boys come out. If you want to make some money, if you want to spread the word to a wider audience, we've got to broaden our appeal. And so, with that rationale, I approved it. It was a decision I definitely shouldn't have made, looking back. The ironic part. We had our biggest crowd ever, our biggest crowd. After the battle, we were all celebrating our success, talking about how we truly packed the house. That's when a Zeta Ranger approached me. She had a stern look on her face and asked directly, "Who approved this flyer?" I admitted, well, I approved it. She really cut into me that day. Initially, in our celebratory high, we kind of laughed it off. She was clearly upset, got into her car, and drove off. But the following Friday, Azita came early to our regular meeting. She pulled me aside and gave me a serious, no-holds-barred talking to about the objectification of women, the responsibility of leadership, and the implicit message we were sending. That was the profound moment for me. It was like, damn, if I'm truly about this life, if I'm about building up my community, I really got to get on it. I really have to integrate these principles. Before that, while I avoided listening to overtly trifling music or promoting violence, I never explicitly used or understood the term misogyny. Azia checked me on it, and her direct confrontation put me squarely on this path of conscious awareness and advocacy. So massive shouts out to Azita Ranger for that truly transformative lesson.
That's a powerful and relatable anecdote. I actually have my own Azita Ranger moment that Professor Kimya's class also used to illustrate the pervasive nature of problematic messaging. I remember she hired me to DJ an event, and she gave me very clear instructions. I don't want anything that's derogatory towards women or derogatory towards men. I thought that was an interesting and inclusive request, aiming to avoid being destructive towards anyone. But then, at the event, I put on just the instrumental beat for a Nas song. Just the beat, as a background while I was speaking to the crowd, completely without the lyrics. And she came over in her characteristic way and fussed me out. I was genuinely confused, saying, I'm not playing the song, I'm just playing the beat. And she looked at me squarely and said, you're playing the instrumental. We know what the words are, and those words are not good for our people. They're embedded in the minds of anyone listening to this beat. It completely messed me up. It showed me how deep the impact of problematic lyrics goes, even when they're not overtly spoken. So drawing from these powerful personal experiences and the insights from Professor Kimya's class, how do we solidify our understanding? What does a comprehensive definition of misogyny, and specifically misogynoir, entail in this context?
For me, stemming from the foundational discussions in class, misogyny is simply the hatred and violence towards women, and then misogynoir is a crucial, more specific term that points to the hatred and violence directed specifically towards Black women. When I say violence, it's critical to understand that I don't just mean physical acts, like punching someone in the face. It extends to doing things that intentionally make women feel uncomfortable, being hostile towards them, engaging in persistent harassment, or enacting behaviors that feel violent, things that genuinely hurt and cause deep, lasting trauma. This broader definition of violence is central to truly grasping the insidious nature of misogyny and misogynoir.
Yes, that overt definition of violence is certainly part of it. But as Professor Kimya's class deeply explored, we need to expand that to look at it in terms of larger, often subtle power dynamics. What's truly fascinating here, and often overlooked, is that power isn't always overtly violent. It's not always characterized by screaming, overt exploitation, or obvious forms of control. A significant form of power can manifest as what we term loving control. This is incredibly important to highlight because many people operate under the assumption that as long as an environment appears peaceful or benevolent, it doesn't matter which group consistently maintains control. If we apply that framework to race, for instance, people can readily grasp what I'm saying. They understand that racial dominance can exist and exert its influence even in seemingly peaceful, nonviolent environments, such as a workplace that appears harmonious but is completely dominated by one racial group. However, when we shift this lens to gender, particularly at the intersection of Blackness and gender, an intersection that pioneering Black women scholars like Anna Julia Cooper wrote about extensively in A Voice from the South, even before W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, it becomes significantly harder for people to grasp. What does it truly mean to be controlled, to be disempowered, even when that control is disguised as loving control? Consider this critical observation, thoroughly analyzed in Professor Kimya's class. Nearly every Black music genre, from its inception to its contemporary forms, is primarily controlled by men, specifically Black men. And quite often, these Black men will strategically claim that they are controlled by external forces, by white Jewish men or other white men. And that narrative frequently serves as a disguise to negate or deflect from the undeniable fact that Black men are indeed the dominant force within nearly all these genres. You can trace this pattern across the entire span of Black music history. In rock and roll, despite pivotal pioneers like Rosetta Tharpe, it is overwhelmingly Black men who are celebrated as the foundational figures and often control the narrative in industry. You see it in religious collectives, in community groups, and certainly in hip-hop. Some might argue that this is simply how it is, citing historical patriarchal structures as an unchangeable reality. But understand this. When you observe consistent control in any form, When one group consistently holds dominance across all these diverse environments, with only rare exceptions, it means that Black women who manage to exert true power dynamics or make significant contributions are frequently labeled as arrogant, aggressive, non-nurturing, or as invading spaces that are supposedly meant to be controlled by men. This leads to another critical insight from our class discussions. If you have spaces where men, and specifically Black men, are consistently the ones in charge, it means that when Black women are included in these spaces, it's often because the Black men have said, we're going to share this space with you. I always emphasize to our students and to you, the listener, that when Black women are included based on permission, it is fundamentally different from truly kicking in the door, waving the 4-4, as Biggie so famously put it. You are, in essence, given permission to come into these spaces to contribute. This dynamic exists precisely because Black women in these structures do not have inherent control. Therefore, it's problematic to compliment Black men for opening spaces for Black women, because that action doesn't reduce Black male control. It simply represents the signing of a permission slip. It's the same power dynamic as when non-Black people sign permission slips to allow Black people into spaces. Black people historically wouldn't say thank you, massa. Instead, we should be demanding and creating more spaces where we don't need permission from anyone, and that imperative absolutely applies to Black women within our own communities and cultural spaces. This systemic control profoundly impacts Black women in hip-hop. They face immense unique difficulties. If they choose to discuss their bodies or sexuality in their music, they often feel compelled to clarify that they're not merely doing it to increase record sales, but as a form of self-expression or empowerment. Yet Black male MCs can seamlessly transition through a whole range of topics: women, drinking, violence, materialism, all within a single song, and audiences will simply jam to it, celebrating their versatility. For women's songs in hip-hop, however, there's often an unspoken demand for singular focus. Stick to the topic, woman, or don't be so emotional are common criticisms. Their lyricism, regardless of its depth or complexity, often gets undervalued, dismissed as if they're simply emotional wrecks, lacking the intellectual rigor of their male counterparts. This is precisely why people are often so genuinely shocked when they first encounter a highly skilled female MC like Lauryn Hill, uttering phrases like, oh, she's really kicking it, she can actually rhyme. But the truth is, Black artistry, African artistry broadly, has always included strong, profound female voices. There are countless incredibly skilled female artists in hip-hop who remain largely unheard by mainstream audiences. Your top MCs lists, driven by popularity and industry marketing, don't necessarily represent the best MCs to ever exist. They're simply the most famous. There are numerous underground female MCs who are performing more global concerts and reaching more diverse audiences than some of these household names. So while male artists might be told shut up and dribble by white power structures in sports or shut up and rhyme in music, women are effectively told stick to the topic. This reveals a deeply gendered form of control over their artistic expression, limiting their range and reception.
Wow, so the misogyny in hip-hop, as Professor Kimya's class illustrated so clearly, isn't just about the lyrics men say. It extends into the very fabric of consumer behavior, industry expectations, and the double standards placed on artists based on their gender. I hadn't fully considered that interconnected web of forces before.
Exactly. And that interconnectedness, that pressure to stick to the topic, extends beyond just music. Professor Kimya's class discussed the perfect example of what happened to Megan Thee Stallion a couple of years ago. She, a prominent female rapper known for her confident and explicit lyrics, openly expressed her love for anime. The internet, surprisingly, went absolutely crazy. People were vehemently declaring, no, you can't be into anime because you only talk about sex. And I'm thinking, if she actively engages with anime, watches the series, and attends major anime conventions, she is an anime fan, regardless of her musical content. What are you talking about? But it perfectly illustrated this pervasive expectation that because she is a woman who talks openly about her body and sex in her music, she should only be confined to that singular topic. The irony is, she grew up in an era where everyone was watching Cartoon Network and Toonami, so of course she would be into anime. It's a natural cultural touchpoint for her generation.
And this isn't merely a modern phenomenon. It has deep historical roots that Professor Kimya's class thoroughly examined. People need to understand the cultural lineage that preceded contemporary hip-hop and animation. Anime and cartoons have, for a very long time, been highly sexualized and created with adult audiences in mind. Even classic Looney Tunes had subversive messages, including problematic depictions like blackface that were intended for adults to understand, not for children. Think about old Cinemax cartoons that featured explicit sexual behavior. Or consider popular video games from the 80s and 90s, like the beloved Mortal Kombat, which I enjoy. In those games, there were often only one or two female characters, and their bodies were typically highly sexualized, designed by predominantly white and Asian men. So misogyny was effectively baked into the cake from the very outset, embedded by the creators of these cultural products. When you then layer hip hop onto that existing framework, you can see how hip hop aesthetics and themes have been expressed within cartoons for a long time, dating back to the 80s and 90s. The visual images accompanying the music were often not reflective of a typical woman's body. They were explicitly sexualized. This problem of ingrained misogyny runs incredibly deep within the creative industries, influencing how female artistry is perceived and consumed across various media.
Now, speaking of challenging conceptions of misogyny in artists who have undeniably generated controversy, let's turn our attention to young M.A. She has definitely drawn some significant slack and pushback, particularly for specific lyrics that have sparked heated debate.
Yeah, absolutely. One prominent example, which we dissected in Professor Kimya's class, is her song, Woo. It was a massive banger, hugely popular, but then you hear that specific lyric, I don't really care about her, I just want what she can do for me. And my immediate reaction, and what we discussed, was, wow, that's functionally the same thing as male misogyny. What's truly striking is that, despite being a female MC, she seems to have more male fans than women fans. Every time I bring her up in conversation, particularly with men, their response is almost uniformly, yo, she's dope. She's dope. I've rarely, if ever, heard a guy say she's all right or offer lukewarm praise. Her style is also notable. She writes in a fashion strikingly similar to Biggie. She truly sounds like a daughter of Biggie, lyrically. She rhymes in that classic, unvarnished New York B-girl style, reminiscent of the raw energy and directness of male MCs from the era that Biggie personified.
That's a keen observation. It's true that while I wasn't initially familiar with young M.A.'s work, once I heard her, I immediately appreciated her boom bap style. She instantly reminded me of artists from the 90s, echoing the raw, grimy sound of groups like Boot Camp Click and even some of the earlier Bad Boy records. Had she emerged during that era, her distinct style and unflinching delivery would have made her a nervous record for someone in the industry, meaning her authentic, hard-hitting approach would have challenged conventions and perhaps made some executives hesitant, precisely because it was so powerful and reminiscent of a specific, influential, male-dominated era.
So the crucial question that arises, and one we spent considerable time debating in Professor Kimya's class, is this. Are her lyrics misogynistic? My unwavering answer, after extensive discussion and reflection, is yes. It doesn't matter who is saying it, whether it's a man or a woman. If the content expresses hatred or violence towards women, or objectifies them for personal gain, then it is, by definition, misogynistic.
This is where the discussion becomes deeply nuanced, as explored in Professor Kimya's class. It's certainly true that the contributions of women to what we might broadly categorize as raunchy music are far from new. Our people have been producing raunchy music for well over a century in the Western Hemisphere. Consider artists like Lucille Bogan from the 1920s and 30s, whose juke joint blues were explicitly sexual and defiant. In that context, the contributions of women to such genres, especially when men were so dominant in expressing similar themes, can indeed be seen as empowering from a Black gender justice perspective. It's Black women actively saying, I'm taking charge of this narrative. I can talk about my body. I can talk about women's bodies and sexuality precisely because I inhabit a woman's body and have agency over my own narrative. So whether young M.A.'s specific lyrics are deemed misogynistic is highly dependent on the context and, crucially, the interpretation. Her expression could certainly have a misogynistic interpretation, depending on the audience and their understanding. Professor Kimya's class firmly believes in the right of a member of an oppressed group to reclaim and redefine a term or expression that has been used against them. It's analogous to when Black people choose to use racial slurs amongst themselves. I personally would never say stop saying that because there are other groups who similarly reclaim terms they don't want anyone else to use. However, and this is the critical distinction, you can inadvertently perpetuate misogyny by putting certain themes and expressions into music, even with an empowering intent. Why? Because men can listen to it, men can sing along, and men can buy into the image being presented, effectively validating and amplifying the very misogynistic tropes that might be intended for reclamation or satire. This raises an incredibly important question for us to grapple with. What is the true role of the artist's intent versus the broader societal impact and interpretation of the art, especially when that art is consumed by a diverse audience, some of whom may interpret it in ways that reinforce harmful existing power structures? This is a tension we constantly explore.
Exactly. And this complex interplay between intent and impact reminds me of the profound insights of sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, whose work on Black intellectualism, including her analysis of hip-hop, is truly foundational.
So what did she articulate about hip-hop that is so vital to our discussion here?
If I recall correctly from Professor Kimya's sessions, and Dreamhampton echoes her on this very point, Collins asserted that we cannot truly call something revolutionary if, at its core, it is simultaneously denigrating women. You simply cannot claim a movement or an art form is fundamentally revolutionary if it's undermining, demeaning, or harming half of the population it purports to liberate or represent.
That's a powerful and necessary truth. Hip-hop, at its heart, is a profoundly powerful tool of communication, a vehicle for storytelling, resistance, and cultural expression. But precisely because of that power, as Professor Kimya's class frequently emphasizes, we really have to check ourselves when it comes to the pervasive presence of misogyny and homophobia within the genre. This critical self-reflection applies not just to the overt creative content, the lyrics, the videos, but also to the often unseen structures. Who's in charge, who's controlling it, who's sitting in the boardroom, and ultimately, who is making the fundamental decisions that shape the industry and its output. While we acknowledge and celebrate the historical presence of Black women in power roles within hip-hop, pioneering figures like Sylvia Robinson of Sugar Hill Records or the contemporary critical voice of Dreamhampton, it's also important to recognize that their stories and influence are often not as widely known or celebrated as those of their male counterparts, highlighting the ongoing imbalance in power.
So, as we approach the conclusion of this deep dive, and you, our listener, have stayed with us through these challenging but vital conversations, you've heard the nuanced analyses of misogyny and its pervasive existence in hip-hop, from its definitions to its manifestations in artists like Biggie Smalls and Young M.A. Let's look forward now. How do we become truly revolutionary in our approach to this issue? How do we address this in a way that, say, in 10 or 20 years, we could realistically look back and say that misogyny in hip-hop has been significantly reduced, if not eradicated? What are the pathways to actual measurable change that Professor Kimya's class has identified?
That kind of dramatic, immediate eradication simply isn't going to happen. And it's crucial to acknowledge that up front, as Professor Kimya's class doesn't advocate for quick fixes. Furthermore, I fundamentally don't believe in censorship in the way some people might imagine it. For goodness sake, I'm a lifelong fan of Two Live Crew, and the idea of banning music, even controversial music, is not a path I or our class endorse.
So you're saying there's no way we can affect a cultural change. Let's take overt censorship off the table, as you said. What other revolutionary approaches are there?
No, I agree with that stance on censorship. I think a significant part of the solution, as we discussed at length in class, needs to be about achieving balance in Black music across the board, not just specifically within hip-hop. What I mean by that is, when you go to an event or when you listen to a radio station, you should be exposed to a much wider variety of artists and styles within the Black musical tapestry. I should be able to go to one spot, one event, and hear Lenny Kravitz alongside Salt from the UK, Megan Thee Stallion, and City Girls, and Ree and Scott. Hearing all that diversity in one place, one unified experience, is essential. Hip-hop should operate the same way. It shouldn't just be one dominant style of hip-hop music being played by a select few artists all the time. It should be an ecosystem where we're listening to everything, appreciating the full spectrum, and crucially talking about it openly and critically.
And that emphasis on talking about it is vital. To illustrate how real change can happen even without overt censorship, consider the historical precedent of reggae artists in the 80s and 90s, a case study frequently examined in our class. That era of reggae was undeniably very, very homophobic, with prominent artists like Buju Banton, Shabba Ranks, and others regularly including violent anti-LGBTQ plus lyrics in their music. Then, a powerful reggae coalition was formed to specifically address this pervasive homophobia in the lyrics. And here's the crucial part. If those artists attempted to tour internationally, particularly in European nations, they found that no European country would grant them visas or allow them to perform if they were going to be spitting those hateful lyrics on stage. That's a clear, powerful example of how external, particularly economic pressure led to tangible changes. That's why you see a marked difference in Buju Banton's lyrics today compared to his younger years. Some artists, notably, have never offered a public apology for their past lyrics, but have conveniently changed their content. However, as Professor Kimya's class often stresses, even if the motivation is purely commercial, if you're changing your lyrics or omitting an offensive track simply because you want to get paid for a concert abroad, at least you are changing something, the actual public expression of hate is reduced. This brings us to a fundamental understanding that Professor Kimya's class consistently reinforces. One key aspect about justice is that justice is going to, oftentimes, come in a monetary way. Justice is not based on morality alone. It's often driven by economic consequences. Black people, and indeed all people seeking change, need to internalize this and stop pretending that fundamental Black justice is going to be solely a result of changing people's minds through moral persuasion. As a social scientist, I can tell you that I genuinely don't believe in the efficacy of many so-called bias trainings. I truly don't care what people are thinking internally or whether their hearts are changing in that moment. My focus and the focus of our discussions is on actions. I tell people, you can hate us, you can hate me, have so much fun with that. What I care about are your actions and their impact. When it comes to hip-hop, reggae, and all different genres with offensive lyrics, when genuine, widespread changes are made, it's not primarily because of grassroots boycotts. While boycotts can raise awareness, people love saying they're going to boycott concerts or purchases, but the real systemic money changes often come from record labels themselves and from influential places abroad, nations, venues, or festivals that simply state, you can't tour here, or we won't platform your music here. That's often where the real impactful changes happen, because honestly, if you truly believe Black folks are going to collectively boycott these artists for misogyny, when they're not even consistently boycotting people like R. Kelly, if R. Kelly were to go on tour now or be allowed to be a surprise guest for artists like Usher or Beyonce, you know how many Black folks would still buy tickets? They wouldn't care. He'd make all the podcast rounds, all the radio calls. The draw of the music often overrides the problematic actions for many consumers.
It's an interesting and sobering point about the economics driving change. It's particularly striking when you consider who the consumer base is. The client I mentioned earlier, the one who specifically asked for 3 R. Kelly songs for her party this coming Monday. She's white. And that observation resonates with a critical point Professor Kimya's class frequently highlights. It's almost as if we, as the creators of this cultural expression, have allowed the denigration of ourselves to become so widespread and so popularized that those who enjoy our cultural output are now slowly, almost inadvertently, accepting some of the very demeaning themes that we ourselves have, regrettably, allowed to become commonplace.
That's a profound observation that the data consistently supports. The majority of our music, meaning music created by Black artists, is actually not purchased by Black people. The overwhelming majority of sales and concert tickets are purchased by white people. So the industry is keenly aware of this demographic reality. If the primary consumer base for Black music were exclusively Black people, like it was in the 1950s, when genres were more ethnically segmented into soul and so forth, then the industry wouldn't care as much about broader criticisms. The problematic content wouldn't be so widespread, it wouldn't generate as much money, it wouldn't sell as many concert tickets, and it certainly wouldn't have entire NPR episodes using it as theme music. So it is mostly white people who represent the majority of non-Black consumers. Therefore, when we're talking about making systemic changes to problematic content, Harold Cruz's profound focus on Black artists as the intellectuals and scholars, the vanguard who are uniquely positioned to advance our people, is crucial. I've often shared readings in the comments of our past sessions that include his perspective, as well as the critiques of rap by Thomas Sowell and William Julius Wilson. What you'll consistently notice in their analyses, however, is that their critiques focused almost exclusively on depictions of violence and poverty, rarely, if ever, on gender-based issues. This highlights a historical blind spot, even among influential scholars, that Professor Kimya's class actively works to correct and expand upon. So we're not advocating for a return to an outdated idea that we can completely change genres by widespread boycotts alone. That's simply not how it works in the current industry landscape. However, for Black people who genuinely want to support more positive change, investing in local artists is a powerful pathway. Many local artists who are less beholden to corporate pressures are not creating misogynistic songs. Now, it's true, a lot of local artists might incorporate falsehoods into their lyrics or religious beliefs not based on verifiable facts, so it's often a trade-off. People have to figure out what kind of content they want to hear and support. This is about embracing a practical reality as Black people. We need to stop pretending that we're going to just stop things from happening all of a sudden, or that we're going to boycott massive entities like BET when, as a matter of fact, most popular Black stations are not even Black-owned in the first place. Yeah. The power dynamics are complex, and our actions need to be strategically informed.
And as someone actively involved in community organizing, I can confirm that these more localized grassroots efforts are indeed happening and showing promise. I'm actively creating ciphers in my community, promoting breakdancing clubs that are opening up, and we're even working to organize a district-wide battle competition for students. These initiatives are not just about entertainment. They're platforms for deeper engagement. I use these very conversations that we have in Professor Kimya's class with my students. And a question we consistently pose is, hey, we don't see a lot of women in these spaces. What's going on? What are the barriers? We're having really dynamic, open conversations about that. But I absolutely agree, we do have to collectively support local artists because fundamentally hip-hop needs to be taken back to being a local community-based art form rather than purely an arm of capitalism, as Dream Hampton so aptly put it.
Yes, exactly. If hip-hop were less an arm of capitalism and more deeply rooted in community, I genuinely believe there would be a significant reduction in misogyny. We would see a more inclusive cipher where everyone, whether we're talking about b-boys, b-girls, graffiti writers, DJs, or organizers, would have equal opportunity to participate. And it's not just about gaining access to existing spaces, but also about truly organizing those spaces and collectively building them from the ground up. I do want to highlight a crucial point that Professor Kimya's class always clarifies. Critiquing hip-hop's capitalist tendencies and advocating for change doesn't require adopting anti-capitalism jargon. Money in itself is simply a tool. The core issue, as we see it, is exploiting labor and exploiting people for profit, not profit itself. This nuanced understanding ties directly into foundational concepts like Huey P. Newton's writings about Black capitalism, which advocate for self-determination and economic empowerment, and the approaches championed by historical figures like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Magdalena Walker. These thinkers, despite their differences, all recognize the importance of economic tools for communal advancement without necessarily demonizing wealth creation itself. So, when we consider pathways forward, we see promising developments. Some of the most prominent male MCs figures like Rakim, KRS-One, Big Daddy Kane, and Kool G Rap are reportedly forming a coalition to address various issues within hip-hop. While these are all men, and some, like Kool G Rap, have themselves faced accusations of violence towards women, we can encourage these influential men to form peaceful coalitions that genuinely present solutions for our people in a way that doesn't have to be based on an underlying assumption of male dominance. Though we know, from historical patterns and ongoing discussions, that confronting and dismantling male dominance is often a difficult concept for most men to fully grasp, precisely because male dominance is frequently perceived as so normal, so inherent to the social fabric. Ultimately, we want our people to have realistic approaches to these complex problems. When you're looking at a community focus for hip-hop, the reality is that it is reaching the community directly. And for artists who want to make money, there are legitimate avenues. We can connect them with Black community organizations that help artists make and sell albums ethically. But again, on the specific issue of misogyny, it requires a deeper engagement. It's about critically examining people's lyrics and having direct conversations with artists, asking them, are you putting this in the song because it truly reflects your genuine beliefs and experiences, or are you doing it primarily because you think it's going to lead to higher record sales? It's a huge, crucial difference because, ironically, sometimes the most overtly offensive songs have the worst sales. Artists thought they would create a splash, but they didn't. And a lot of times, people aren't even deeply listening to your lyrics. They're just jamming to a good beat. Sometimes artists think they're making a profound point with misogynistic lyrics, but their audience isn't actually looking for that from them. For instance, while Rakim's work has some elements of male dominance, if he were to release a truly overtly misogynistic song today, a significant portion of his fan base would likely react with confusion and disappointment, thinking, are you serious right now? Go find Eric B again, you're wilding out. This suggests that even within mainstream hip-hop, there's a nuanced expectation from listeners.
I honestly thought we were quite limited in identifying concrete solutions for such a deeply entrenched issue. But you know what? You're absolutely right. We've outlined a multitude of realistic, actionable solutions.
No, we are not limited at all. We just gave you a long, comprehensive list. Black folks, if you don't recognize solutions without me having to do a PowerPoint slide, I'm going to fight all of you. No, I'm talking about this in general. Black folks are always going to struggle if you go into these conversations thinking that any authentic, effective answer is not going to sound like a perfectly packaged good answer. That's just not the reality of systemic change.
It's true, and that realism is essential. You know, it's powerful to reflect on. Before this session, we were talking about how back in the day, here in the 757 area code and in the 804, we used to organize community events where people would genuinely bring their entire families. There was no drama, no problematic content. And these events fostered incredible positive energy. And years later, people would approach us and say, yo, I became a breaker because I saw y'all do this. I became a DJ because y'all put this together.
Yeah.
That kind of direct, positive cultural change influencing younger generations is absolutely possible and has a proven track record.
Exactly. And those community-driven models are precisely what Professor Kimya's class champions as tangible pathways forward. There are numerous local DJs who are actively curating positive, inclusive sets, and there are Black chambers of commerce and other Black community groups that are consciously connecting with aspiring hip-hop artists and youth who want to be deeply connected with hip-hop culture. There are so many viable options that are actually happening already in cities and towns across the country. It's about teaching people how to refine their lyricism, how to be creative, profound, and impactful without feeling the need to add just random, offensive stuff purely because they think, yeah, this is going to offend so-and-so, and I want to offend people because it's going to go viral all over the internet if I shock someone. Again, for those who seek a quick, easy answer to complex social problems, Black folks are always going to struggle if you think that any authentic answer is not going to sound like it has immediate, perfect solutions. The work is ongoing, but the paths are clear.
So we've gone on quite a journey today, embarking on a deep dive that has meticulously unpacked the complex issue of misogyny in hip-hop. We've explored its deep historical roots, its pervasive manifestations in lyrics, from Biggie Smalls' often disturbing themes to Young M.A.'s controversial lines, and the intricate systemic issues embedded within the industry structures. We've seen how misogyny isn't always overt violence. It can manifest as a subtle, often disguised, loving control, a nuanced power dynamic that dictates what women can and cannot express, even within their own artistic creations. We've also critically examined how accountability for powerful figures in the industry often only comes into play when their influence wanes, and how expectations for female artists differ drastically and unfairly from their male counterparts, limiting their artistic freedom and public perception.
And while this deep dive has revealed that there are no simple, quick answers to such a deeply ingrained cultural issue, it has also provided a long list of realistic, actionable approaches and historical precedents for change. From the compelling power of external monetary pressure, as effectively seen in the reggae scene's shift away from homophobia, to the vital role of community-based hip-hop initiatives and the critical importance of supporting local artists, the solutions are real and are actively being implemented in various forms. It means consistently focusing on Black artists as intellectuals and cultural scholars who can genuinely advance our people, fostering a necessary balance and diversity in our music, and encouraging artists to engage in profound self-reflection about their true motivations behind their lyrics. These solutions may not offer a snap-your-fingers fix, but they represent concrete, ongoing paths toward a more equitable, just, and authentic future for hip-hop.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener, as you continue to engage with hip-hop and other forms of art and culture? We encourage you to actively consider how you, as a conscious consumer and a participant in this evolving cultural landscape, can contribute to the ongoing evolution of hip-hop and other art forms. What does it truly mean for you to engage with art critically, consciously choosing to support voices that uplift, challenge, and expand perspectives, while simultaneously understanding the complex historical, economic, and social forces at play that fundamentally shape what we hear, consume, and celebrate? This is not a static conversation. An ongoing dynamic dialogue, and your informed role in it is absolutely crucial.